Gulf of St. Lawrence, latitude 51 degrees north, longitude 60 degrees west. The Écho des Mers is 500 kilometers out of Rimouski, her home port on the shore of the St. Lawrence River, and headed for Labrador. This former sounding ship of the Canadian Coast Guard is taking its 40 passengers on a discovery cruise of the St. Lawrence and in particular the lower North Shore. Even for the Quebecois themselves, this region situated across from Newfoundland is synonymous with the ends of the earth. And yet here, between land and water, is where the entire history of this country began.
It's really rough out here, with the snow, the rain, the wind, the ice coming down, the ice pack, the icebergs. When you think of Jacques Cartier and Champlain, all those explorers who sailed up the river for the first time, I think it's really incredible. These men came over from Europe knowing absolutely nothing about the territory. They'd never seen such bad weather and snow like here. So to sail up the river as far as Quebec in those little ships, I wonder just how they did it.
3,700 kilometers long, the St. Lawrence is Canada's second longest river after the Mackenzie. The Écho des Mers will take us through the estuary where fresh water from the river meets the salt water of the ocean, several hundred kilometers along the lower north shore of Quebec, all the way to Blanc-Sablon on the boundary line with Labrador. But Quebec City is where we'll be starting our voyage, discovering the St. Lawrence. Convinced that he had at long last discovered the passage to Cathay, that is to say India, Jacques Cartier headed up the St. Lawrence. A few days later he discovered a site inhabited by an Algonquin tribe. Its name, Quebec, which means where the river narrows. That was in August 1535. However, it was not until 1608 that Champlain founded the city that was to become the cradle of French influence in North America. During its early years, Quebec was no more than a wooden fort used as a base for missionary work and the fur trade with the Huron and Algonquin. Like all the French colonies in North America, Quebec in 1759 fell into English hands. And yet today, in the heart of the old town dominated by the only fortifications in North America, the Quebecois cultivate the symbols of the past and the 150 years of French presence.
These are the original colors. You know, at the time, red colors were very difficult and very expensive to make. As the King of France didn't have that type of money, he dressed his soldiers in blue, much more sober and much less expensive. Here you have the three-cornered hat, and if you would turn your head, you can see the black cockade, which means that back then these irregular companies were the only ones directly under the orders of King Louis XIV.
Paris, however, was more concerned with its colonies in the Antilles than the ones in Canada, and New France was very slow to develop. In 1750, there were only 70,000 inhabitants, whereas the English colonies had 400,000.
18th century Quebec was a village of maybe a few hundred people, a trading post surrounded by a few buildings. There were also some farmers, mostly further out in the region. Ile d'Orléans, among others, supplied food. As far as food staples were concerned, only a few sailing ships a year called at Quebec after stopping at Louisbourg, because there was a triangular trade route connecting France, the West Indies, Louisbourg, and Quebec City.
The 19th century brought Canada into the industrial age. The St. Lawrence, which for centuries had seen fur-laden canoes, schooners loaded with wood, and clippers carrying rum from the Antilles, now witnessed the arrival of the first steamships. For a long time, steam and sail shared the waterway until the steam vessels were powerful enough to brave the winds, currents, and tides. We'll be discovering this adventure at the Museum of the Old Port of Quebec.
In 1850, there were hundreds, even thousands of boats moored in Quebec's harbor. There were Scots, Irish, French, and British sailors, all here in the same harbor. They were here mainly to take on wood. So in 1850, Quebec's port was swarming with activity.
For a long time, the holds of these great sailing ships would be loaded with wood on the way to Europe and filled with immigrants on the return trip. The voyage was difficult, hygiene was poor, but the route via the St. Lawrence was heavily traveled because it was the quickest way to get to New York, Detroit, and Chicago. From the Dufresne Terrace on the old ramparts, you can observe the cargo ships or ferry boats that run between Quebec and the Lévis on the opposite shore. The Dufresne Terrace, whose famous boardwalk at the foot of the impressive Hotel Chateau Frontenac dates from the 19th century, it's a favorite spot for a stroll and a showcase for history. Grosse Île, just a few kilometers from Quebec, is more than a place to picnic. This peaceful island in the middle of the St. Lawrence was at the heart of an incredible human tragedy in the 19th century. For Mariana Gallagher, a trip to Grosse Île is a kind of pilgrimage. After the Napoleonic Wars, a rising tide of English, Scots, and especially Irish headed for North America, and Canada in particular. This immigration, unprecedented on the St. Lawrence, happened at a time when England was being ravaged by severe epidemics, particularly cholera. In order to protect Quebec, the immigrants' main port of entry, the colonial authorities decided to set up a quarantine station on Grosse Île in 1832. Up until 1860, an average of 30,000 immigrants a year came to Quebec. But once the regular steamer routes were in operation on the North Atlantic at the beginning of the 20th century, the immigration soared. English, Irish, and Scandinavians as well. There were 100,000 new arrivals in 1910, 250,000 in 1914. Inspection, disinfection of the ships, the passengers, and the baggage, vaccinations, housing, health checks. At the beginning of the 20th century, quarantine usually lasted about 6 days, a far cry from the conditions that immigrants found in the tragic year of 1847.
This monument is very dear to my family. When my grandfather Jeremy, who was born 10 years before the Great Famine in Ireland, immigrated to Canada, he and other people from Quebec worked on the construction of this wonderful cross. Everything that's inscribed on it speaks of a time that was very dear to our history. On this side, the inscription says, The sons and daughters of Ireland were driven here by unjust laws and an imposed famine.
God save Ireland, que Dieu sauve l'Irlande.
(1845 to 1849) were somber years for Ireland. The years when more than 1 million people died in the Great Famine, and another million left Europe for America. 1847 was to be a devastating year. 100,000 people embarked for Quebec on overcrowded, unhealthy sailing ships. Stricken with typhus and dysentery, 5,000 of them died during the voyage. On Grosse Île, the authorities, overwhelmed by this flood of humanity, were unable to avoid the catastrophe.
Ce bâtiment-ci, c'est un de 12 hôpitaux qui ont été construits.
This is one of the 12 hospital buildings prefabricated in July 1847 by the shipbuilders of the naval shipyard in Quebec. At first, they thought they would house healthy people, but even before they were finished, they had been turned into hospitals because there was such a desperate need for care. When a ship would come into the channel, a doctor would go on board to inspect the passengers. If anybody was sick, all the passengers would have to disembark here and the ship was cleaned. The summer of 1847 was very hot. They say that anybody who wasn't already sick got sick when they came here. They lived in such overcrowded conditions, one on top of the other. You can imagine what a job the priests must have had, taking care of the sick and dying here in this spot that means so much to us.
The Echo des Mers has just left Rimouski, heading northeast, destination Havre Saint-Pierre. The part of St. Lawrence that we've just left was hardly 2 miles wide, but now it opens up and measures 60 kilometers from shore to shore. We're entering the realm of the estuary, a realm inhabited by whales, this man's passion. He's Pierre-Henri Fontaine, a lecturer.
Alors si vous êtes encore réveillé ce soir à 9h, eh bien la deuxième partie de la conférence portera sur les mysticènes des baleines à fanon ce soir.
By morning, Havre Saint-Pierre is in sight. Havre Saint-Pierre, founded by fishermen from the Magdalene Islands, is now a small town whose economy largely depends on ilmenite, a natural titanium and iron oxide, which is mined 40 kilometers to the north. The inhabitants of Havre Saint-Pierre have inherited a language from their Acadian ancestors, the Cayenne, a deformation of the word Acadian. For his whole life, Roland Jonth, 84, has been playing with the words of this simple, colorful language, creating thousands of little poems describing life on the Mingan Islands.
When we were young, Mingan Islands belonged to the Hudson Bay Company. Then in 1973, the Hudson Bay Company sold them to La Dom Petroleum of Calgary, the oil company. And in 1983, the Canadian government bought the Mingan Islands to make them a national park. When we were young, we'd go to school till we were 14. But in the winter, we didn't have much in the way of entertainment. Didn't have radio, no movie theatres. There wasn't anything when we were young. Then one day my uncle lent me 2 volumes of a young people's encyclopedia. Well, reading that encyclopedia, I came across writing that I thought was beautiful. Works of Victor Hugo and Lamartine. Well, I took to that, and I learned to write in that style. Then I get the idea of writing down our legends and local history here, because I figure, if I or someone else don't put them down in writing, all our history and anecdotes will be lost.
Roland Jean sometimes shares his tales in public, particularly the stories about the monoliths of the Mingan Archipelago National Park.
C'est l'île d'en face qu'on appelle l'île du Hors, avec les 2 îles au Macto, l'île d'en face. Je voulais rocher user autant, petit bonheur, loin de la ville. Au bord de l'eau, rêve le temps, et la journée passe tranquille.
In the heart of this natural preserve, made up of more than 40 islands and thousands of islets, you find among other wildlife pods of seals. Sometimes, like here in the protected cove of Quarry Isle, where the Echo des Mers has anchored, rorquals come for a peaceful meal. But the most striking thing is undoubtedly the incredible concentration of these strangely shaped monoliths. Limestone sentinels keeping watch for the invisible. These monoliths, nicknamed pot de fleurs, flower pots, tell a tale that is 20,000 years old. At that time, a layer of ice 2.5 kilometers thick covered Mingani. 10,000 years later, after a period of global warming, it was submerged under 85 meters of water. Then, as it gradually emerged from the ocean depths, the limestone cliff was eaten away by the combined forces of the wind, the frost, and the tides, offering this amazing spectacle, the most important concentration of erosion monoliths in the world. The Echo des Mers is underway once more, headed east for Harrington Harbor on the lower north shore of the St. Lawrence. The land God reserved for Cain is how Jacques Cartier described this region, marked by a harsh, changeable climate and wind-blown barren landscapes, when he first landed here in 1534. No roads lead here. The only way in and out for the 15 villages of the lower shore is the St. Lawrence, and even then only during the few months when it's not frozen over. In the villages, Native Americans, French and English speakers live side by side. Like here in Harrington Harbor, where the 300 inhabitants, descendants of Newfoundland fishermen who emigrated here in 1871, have built up a village of pastel houses rooted on the rocky cape facing the sea. When they arrived here, the coasters, as they call themselves, learned from the Native Americans how to live in harmony with nature and the river. Thus, during the harshest months of the winter, when the river was frozen, they would take refuge inland where they would hunt. In the spring, they would come back to their village of Harrington, with its lovely houses built up on piles and its wooden sidewalks. Clarence Roselle, who used to run the general store, recalls those times.
Most of the trade when I was a small boy and when my father was bringing up his family came in from Halifax in the Maritimes. And they came here with schooner loads. They brought in the goods. They traded with took the fish, bought all salt cod, salted and dried. They sold all the cod that way. They bought the seal oil if there was any here. The seals were rendered out and they bought that oil and they carried it back on the schooners to Halifax. People, what happened, the people used to move back. They had a winter house and a summer house. And of course, money was hard to get. And if you had to have two of everything to move, and it seemed as if the people that were moving back to the mainland in the winter, sometimes they would be in the woods, they'd miss a good sealfish. Right? Some more times they would go in early and there might be some late fish. So the people seemed like the ones that stayed out nearer the shore seemed to gain a little more.
Those times that Clarence Roselle recalls are long gone. Seal hunting is illegal. The cod, which at one time was so abundant that the Basques would readily cross the Atlantic to fish for them, have deserted the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Whether out of concern for the environment or simple respect for the laws, Harrington Harbor has now become the center for an industry of snow crab fishing. The snow crab is a kind of huge spider crab and is very much in demand. Once the snow crab season is over, Harrington Harbor hunkers down for the long haul through winter. No more boats will land here. The Nordic Express, which supplies the town, won't be back before April or even May, depending on the ice thaw. Yet, oddly enough, the inhabitants of Harrington Harbor don't seem at all worried by their coming isolation. And if you listen to Amy Evans, you'd even think they're looking forward to it.
I was born here in Harrington, and so all my family were born here. We have a very good relationship, you know, with all the villages. It's like, because people know each other on the coast. It's like a big family, I think. The winters are full of activity, in a sense that with the now it's skidoo, of course, and so people travel. You get around more. You're not as isolated, really.
It is a beautiful place to live. The freedom is great. The hair is still great. And I would say that I wouldn't change my life for any part of the world. If they gave me Montreal, well, I might take it because it's worth a lot, but I wouldn't stay there.
The day is drawing to a close, and the Echo des Mers is once again underway. Up in the bridge, the captain seems lost in his thoughts. There's a saying, to live happily, live hidden. What if that were the reason for living of Clarence, Amy, and all the other inhabitants of Harrington Harbor? Down in the galley of the Echo des Mers, Sylvie has just one thing to take care of: preparing meals for the 40 passengers and the 10 crew members. But things don't always go as smoothly as she would like.
Unfortunately, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool landlubber. When it rolls a little bit, it's okay. But when the seas get heavy, I get sick. I wish I didn't, but on the other hand, it gives me a little time off, and I've got to go lie down. Jacqueline, the second cook, is a much better sailor than me, so she stays on and I go to bed. And she gets to sleep late the next morning. Tonight it'll be scallops in a puff pastry with pink pepper. A lot of people like this recipe. It's a good-looking dish.
de la gueule dans l'assiette. Il y a même du monde qui viennent dans la cuisine après.
When we make the scallops in pink pepper, people will come down into the galley and kiss us and tell us how much they enjoyed it.
Ils ont trouvé ça beau.
Avec une labriole blanche, c'est ça?
Woohoo! Là, ça commence.
Oh boy, here we go again.
Puis on dirait, je sais pas qu'est-ce
I just don't know why, but every time we make these scallops, we run into a roller coaster.
Que ça brasse. Je comprends pas.
I don't get it.
Je sais pas si
There must be some kind of jinx on the
un mauvais sort
scallops.
sur les pétoncles, mais en tout cas.
The weather is very temperamental on the lower shore. When we come into Tête à la Baleine, situated in the heart of the archipelago, the leaden gray clouds that cover the sky in Harrington Harbor have scattered, and the bright sun offers us a landscape of bright colors. Like Tête à la Baleine, Whale's Head, which gets its name from its resemblance to a breaching whale, every one of the islands of the archipelago has its own story.
Whether they're rocks that almost go under at high tide or the larger islands, they all have their name that evokes a place or the people that live there, or anecdotes that happen there. Île à Beaulieu, Île Haché, Île à Couteau, Le Cap d'Oie, or like here in front of us, Le Caille à Morue, Les Petites Sœurs. All these islands have their name. They even call this the archipelago of the Thousand Islands. It seems that came from Jacques Cartier when he sailed through here on his first trip.
Even though they came from Jersey or Guernsey, the inhabitants of Tête à la Baleine are French speakers. Unlike the people of Harrington Harbor, who would migrate inland for the winter, the inhabitants of Tête à la Baleine used to move to Providence Island, 10 kilometers further out at sea, to be closer to the fishing banks.
I grew up on the other island, to the east, the one we call Le Rigolet. There were several families living there. As soon as I could walk, I took my first trip to Providence, because that yellow house over there belonged to my grandfather. We'd go to church every Sunday. Back then it was practically an obligation, a duty. The whole family would go to Sunday Mass, weather permitting. During the first days of summer vacation, you'd see the families getting on the boats to go out to the islands. Even the general store would move out to the island for the summer. The folks had two houses, the winter house inland and a summer house on the islands. They would bring out the essentials. Some houses were better equipped, so the people didn't have to bring out as much. But most of the people would move everything they might need during the summer to their sea house.
Little by little, as motorboats replaced sailboats, this custom died out, and the town of Providence was gradually abandoned. In the 1960s, the inhabitants even decided to move their summer houses back to Tête à la Baleine. Quite a sight. Now they go out to the islands only on weekends. Just one retired couple has decided to live here for the whole summer, like in the old days.
We come out here for 4 or 5 months.
That's not too long?
Oh, no. It's very interesting. We have lots to do. We work on our houses. Then there's fishing. Then we pick the fruit, the shikutai. We were raised like this, so it's a way of reliving our childhood.
We're off again, headed northeast. Since we've left Rimouski, the passengers have spent hours searching the horizon for the slightest sign of whales. A fluke, a spout, but no luck.
Votre attention, s'il vous plaît. Nous avons un petit rorcal qui saute hors de l'eau environ 1 kilomètre à droite.
However, today, their long wait has paid off, with interest.
This is really one of the world's choice spots to observe cetaceans. I think that the St. Lawrence is one of the only regions where you find so many different species concentrated in such a small area. You get a lot of upwelling here. That means that the water from the bottom rises and fertilizes the surface water. It brings up a vast amount of food. So obviously the predators come to feed off this prey, which is extremely abundant.
The spectacle of these humpbacked whales, these 30-ton acrobats leaping out of the water with the grace of a prima ballerina, is truly a gift from the river gods. The captain has to get back underway, but he's hoping to see more whales.
If we want to see some more whales, it will be within the next hour, if we're lucky.
The Nordic Express, on the other hand, doesn't have time to stop. After it gets to Blanc-Sablon, it still has to call at several villages on the lower shore before it can head back to Rimouski. Once again, the weather proves quite changeable. Very quickly, the sky has darkened and the sea has turned rough. But our luck is with us, and we spot some more whales.
Over there, you can see a group of common rorquals swimming along. I think they just finished eating because I saw one of them dive over on his side. And that is typical when they have just eaten. It looks like they had enough to eat, and now they are calmly moving on.
The whales have been following the same migration routes for thousands of years. Every springtime they come back to the rich waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence after their winter in the warmer waters of the Caribbean. Whaling, which used to be practiced as a craft, particularly by the Native Americans, had become industrialized over the centuries, reaching a peak in the 20th century. When we get to Blanc-Sablon, we'll learn about the role the North Shore played in the saga of whaling. We're leaving Blanc-Sablon, whose only positive aspect is probably the fact that it's located right across from Newfoundland and heading for Red Bay in Labrador. The story of Red Bay is above all the story of the Basques. The Basques first came to Labrador a few decades before Jacques Cartier. After having exterminated all the right whales, they had been hunting for centuries in the Bay of Biscay. From then on, they would head out from Europe in the month of June, either by the northern route opened by the Vikings during their amazing voyage of the year 1000, or by the southern route via the Azores. After a 60-day crossing, they would hunt the whales just before they started their migration towards the warm southern seas. The Basque galleons, sailed by a crew of about 50 men, could take on a load of up to 800 barrels. Once the whale blubber was melted down, the oil, which was used for domestic lighting, was stored in these barrels. A number of artifacts and tools recuperated from a sunken wreck in the middle of the bay are on display at the Basque Museum of Red Bay. Barrels, harpoons, and this chalupa, a skiff manned by 6 rowers. The Basque used them to hunt mainly the right whale because it's the slowest whale, but even more so because the body floats once it has been killed. Since the time of the Basques, the Gulf of St. Lawrence has always been considered a high-risk navigation route. With the storms, the currents, and the icebergs, the shipwrecks between Newfoundland and Labrador number in the thousands. It's for this reason that dating from 1647, when Abraham Martin was named the first royal pilot of New France, pilot stations were established further and further upstream to guide the navigators, like this one in Les Escoumins. The St. Lawrence is a veritable highway between the Atlantic and the Great Lakes in the industrial heart of America. Close to 5,000 ships, mainly cargo ships, use it every year, even in winter, for icebreakers have been keeping a clear passage up the middle of the river since the early 1960s. In spite of the sophisticated technology that today's ships are equipped with, they need a pilot between Les Escoumins and Montreal. The St. Lawrence is still dangerous, and the many pleasure craft in circulation during the summer make things even worse, especially on foggy days.
During the summer season, you get a whole fleet of fishing and observation boats. I have to say that basically we get along well. The people have good training, and you never hear about any collisions or near misses. They'll observe the movements of the ships, and that's when they'll be extra careful.
The head of the pilot station has been notified by radio of the arrival of a cargo ship. Using only radar, he steers his pilot ship out to the middle of the river, where he has to pick up a fellow pilot who embarked in Montreal.
Of course, it's helpful to have a pilot, because you can't expect every captain in the world to know all the ins and outs of the river. So as the captains who arrive here don't know the St. Lawrence River with all its dangers and reefs, we have trained pilots for that. They, of course, know all the tides and currents and can guide the ships through.
Unfortunately, it was just after the pilot went ashore at the Pointe-au-Père station that the wreck of the Empress of Ireland took place. Hundreds of wrecks are lying on the bottom of the river. Cargo ships, 3 masters, simple schooners. But of all the shipwrecks, the Empress of Ireland will forever remain the most tragic in the history of the St. Lawrence. The former pilot station of Pointe-au-Père near Rimouski is now a museum dedicated to navigation on the St. Lawrence. It possesses in particular a collection of posters and models that tells the saga of the great ocean liners back in the glory days when they reigned over the North Atlantic. "172 meters long, the Empress of Ireland, which did the Liverpool-Quebec run, was one of them."
The ship was built in 1905 and began sailing in 1906. There could be rich people as well as immigrants on board. There were a lot of people who worked, among other places, in the United States, in the automobile factories, and they would go back to their country for a few months when there were layoffs.
The wreck of the Empress of Ireland lies at the bottom of the St. Lawrence, somewhere off Pointe-au-Père. Whereas the sinking of the Titanic in 1912 had incredible repercussions, that of the Empress of Ireland 2 years later went almost unnoticed. The First World War, which had just broke out, pushed the catastrophe off to the sidelines. The location of the wreck was practically forgotten until the month of May 1964.
It was a magazine article published in May '64 that allowed us to discover the Empress. It was the 50th anniversary of that tragic shipwreck. So we took the magazine, formed a group, and started tracking it down. We had never heard of the Empress before that. It was the first time.
The Empress left the port of Quebec the 28th of May, 1914 at 4:27 p.m. It was carrying 1,057 passengers and 252 ingots of silver, as well as the 2,600 tons of coal it needed to make the crossing to Liverpool.
The ship was sailing down the navigable waterway of the St. Lawrence to Pointe-au-Père. At the time, Pointe-au-Père was a pilot station, so the ship had to slow down when it got to Pointe-au-Père to let the pilot go ashore. They figured that from there on, the ship could proceed on its own, without a pilot. At the same time, the Norwegian coaler, the Storstad, was coming up in the opposite direction. They each warned the other of their presence, but unfortunately, with the confusion and the fog, one of the ships changed course and they collided. With its momentum and the currents, the Storstad gently backed out of the Empress's hull, which of course left a gaping hole. An enormous quantity of water flooded in. As a result, the Empress keeled right over on its side, which made practically all the lifeboats useless. They managed to launch only 4 or 5 of the lifeboats. So, 14 minutes after the collision, it was all over. The huge ship had sunk in the St. Lawrence River.
We're nearly back to Rimouski, and the captain of the Echo des Mers is somewhat wistful. He loves this river so much that he would like to sail it forever.
It takes a lifetime to learn how to really navigate this coast. When you take to the sea, it's not just the job, it's also the beauty of the sea. The French singer Renaud says, it's not the man who takes to the sea, it's the sea that takes the man. And I totally agree. I was born with my toes in the water of the St. Lawrence. So I've always been near the water. I would really like my granddaughter or my grandson to be a sailor. It would make me a bit sad to be the last one of my family. Now I'm savoring every minute, since I know that this may be my last year on the ship, my last year on the water. I'm a bit sad, yes, and emotional. As I speak about it, I'm moved.
How could we bring our voyage to a close without going to the source, the original Algonquin and Montagnais populations? For these Native Americans, the St. Lawrence meant everything, a transportation route, an inexhaustible source of food. They named it Magtogoek, the road that walks. When Jacques Cartier arrived in 1534, there were 25,000 Native Americans living in Quebec. These nomads would move up and down the river in their canoes and lived from fishing, hunting, and gathering. The Montagnais community founded the village of Papinachua near Betsiamit in order to carry on and preserve their ancestral customs. For them, this is the best response to the danger of cultural assimilation.
Back then, the Indians used to live scattered throughout the forest. Then when they started the logging and hydroelectric industries, the government decided to keep the Indians on the seacoast. The St. Lawrence River is what we call the sea. So they created these territories and they put the Indians here, with the free health care, the free education, and all the rest of it. And that was the beginning of a long ordeal and the program dependence that still persists to this day.
With their seeming idleness and a certain taste for modern possessions, particularly among the young, one could fear that they're abandoning their roots, their traditions, and their ancestral way of life. However, the Montagnais nation is still very much alive, thanks to their language, which they teach, transmit, and speak on an everyday basis.
I take pride in being a Montagnais, but before, when I was 25, I didn't give a rap about it. I couldn't have cared less about my culture. It was my father who really opened my eyes about what it means to be Innu Montagnais. From that time on, I've been aware of the importance of being Innu, the importance of the culture as well. That's why today I'm very proud to say that I'm Innu Montagnais.
Now, Gérard would like to teach the youth of the community to appreciate the symbols of the Montagnais culture. In the center of the village stands the Chabadouin, the traditional tent where the council of elders used to meet and where the shaman would invoke the spirits. Certain inhabitants of Betsiamites teach trapping and hunting for beaver and other small game. Others keep alive the traditional way of fishing and canoeing. In spite of this concerted pedagogical effort, the Papinashwa, one of the branches of the Montagnais tribe, haven't lost their sense of humor. And it's true that in their language, the word Papinashwa means the people who like to laugh.
In the olden days, the rivers used to be our highways. Towards the middle of August, our people would use the waterways to get to the hunting grounds. They had to get inland into the forest before the water froze. It could sometimes take a month and a half to get to the territory. During the winter, out back in the territory, moose, hare, partridge, that was our food store. And in the summer, they would come back to the shores of the St. Lawrence, to what were called the summer camps, and the river would supply the food: seal, duck, and salmon.
Gros Isle, just a few kilometers from Quebec, is more than a place to picnic. This peaceful island in the middle of the St. Lawrence was at the heart of an incredible human tragedy in the 19th century. For Mariana Gallagher, a trip to Gros Isle is a kind of pilgrimage. After the Napoleonic Wars, a rising tide of English, Scots, and especially Irish headed for North America, and Canada in particular. This immigration, unprecedented on the St. Lawrence, happened at a time when England was being ravaged by severe epidemics, particularly cholera. In order to protect Quebec, the immigrants' main port of entry, the colonial authorities decided to set up a quarantine station on Gros Isle in 1832. Up until 1860, an average of 30,000 immigrants a year came to Quebec. But once the regular steamer routes were in operation on the North Atlantic at the beginning of the 20th century, the immigration soared. English, Irish, and Scandinavians as well. There were 100,000 new arrivals in 1910. 250,000 in 1914. Inspection, disinfection of the ships, the passengers, and the baggage, vaccinations, housing, health checks. At the beginning of the 20th century, quarantine usually lasted about 6 days, a far cry from the conditions that immigrants found in the tragic year of 1847.
Ce monument est très précieux dans...
The Gulf of St. Lawrence, latitude 51 degrees north, longitude 60 degrees west. The Écho des Mers is 500 kilometers out of Rimouski, her home port on the shore of the St. Lawrence River, and headed for Labrador. This former sounding ship of the Canadian Coast Guard is taking its 40 passengers on a discovery cruise of the St. Lawrence and in particular the lower North Shore. Even for the Quebecois themselves, this region situated across from Newfoundland is synonymous with the ends of the earth. And yet here, between land and water, is where the entire history of this country began.
It's really rough out here, with the snow, the rain, the wind, the ice coming down, the ice pack, the icebergs. When you think of Jacques Cartier and Champlain, all those explorers who sailed up the river for the first time, I think it's really incredible. These men came over from Europe knowing absolutely nothing about the territory. They'd never seen such bad weather and snow like here. So to sail up the river as far as Quebec in those little ships, I wonder just how they did it.
3,700 kilometers long, the St. Lawrence is Canada's second longest river after the Mackenzie. The Écho des Mers will take us through the estuary where fresh water from the river meets the salt water of the ocean, several hundred kilometers along the lower north shore of Quebec. St. Lawrence, which for centuries had seen fur-laden canoes, schooners loaded with wood and clippers carrying rum from the Antilles, now witnessed the arrival of the first steamships. For a long time, steam and sail shared the waterway until the steam vessels were powerful enough to brave the winds, currents, and tides. We'll be discovering this adventure at the Museum of the Old Port of Quebec.
In 1850, there were hundreds, even thousands of boats moored in Quebec's harbor. There were Scots, Irish, French, and British sailors, all here in the same harbor. They were here mainly to take on wood. So in 1850, Quebec's port was swarming with activity.
For a long time, the holds of these great sailing ships would be loaded with wood on the way to Europe and filled with immigrants on the return trip. The voyage was difficult. Hygiene was poor, but the route via the St. Lawrence was heavily traveled because it was the quickest way to get to New York, Detroit, and Chicago. From the Dufresne Terrace on the old ramparts, you can observe the cargo ships or ferry boats that run between Quebec and the Lévis on the opposite shore. The Dufresne Terrace, whose famous boardwalk at the foot of the impressive Hôtel Château Frontenac dates from the 19th century, it's a favorite spot for a stroll and a showcase for history.
These are the original colors. You know, at the time, red colors were very difficult and very expensive to make. As the King of France didn't have that type of money, he dressed his soldiers in blue, much more sober and much less expensive. Here you have the three-cornered hat, and if you would turn your head, you can see the black cockade, which means that back then these irregular companies were the only ones directly under the orders of King Louis XIV.
Paris, however, was more concerned with its colonies in the Antilles than the ones in Canada, and New France was very slow to develop. In 1750, there were only 70,000 inhabitants, whereas the English colonies had 400,000.
18th century Quebec was a village of maybe a few hundred people, a trading post surrounded by a few buildings. There were also some farmers, mostly further out in the region. Ile d'Orléans, among others, supplied food. As far as food staples were concerned, only a few sailing ships a year called at Quebec after stopping at Louisbourg, because there was a triangular trade route connecting France, the West Indies, Louisbourg, and Quebec City.
The 19th century brought Canada into the industrial age. The St. all the way to Blanc-Sablon on the boundary line with Labrador. But Quebec City is where we'll be starting our voyage, discovering the St. Lawrence. Convinced that he had at long last discovered the passage to Cathay, that is to say India, Jacques Cartier headed up the St. Lawrence. A few days later he discovered a site inhabited by an Algonquin tribe. Its name, Quebec, which means where the river narrows. That was in August 1535. However, it was not until 1608 that Champlain founded the city that was to become the cradle of French influence in North America. During its early years, Quebec was no more than a wooden fort used as a base for missionary work and the fur trade with the Huron and Algonquin. Like all the French colonies in North America, Quebec in 1759 fell into English hands. And yet today, in the heart of the old town dominated by the only fortifications in North America, the Quebecois cultivate the symbols of the past and the 150 years of French presence.